Hi, I'm Shashank Narayan. I lead up our product development and product management at AGI. Been with AGI for about 20 years and have done a variety of different roles over the last 20 years, mostly in development, but increasingly with product management. So one of the things that we've done over the last several years as part of product managers at AGI is we visit our customers quite often to try and get feedback from them in terms of how they use our products, what sorts of problems that they try and solve with our products, and what kinds of issues they run into. So basically try to get as much feedback so that we can build the best products for our customers to solve real problems. But over the last 2 to 3 years, we've been mostly increasingly focusing on our enterprise customers. So those of our customers that have large numbers of users of our product. Just to give you an idea, last year we met with 6 different major enterprise organizations. We interviewed 49 different customers, users, and spent over 19 hours talking to these different users and generated about 51 pages of notes. So again, and we sincerely thank these organizations and their users for allowing us to learn from them. So what did we learn? We've seen a common theme across most of these different organizations and these different users. Given that these are large organizations that work on different initiatives and different programs and capture efforts, there is intellectual property and content that is being created across these different organizations for a lot of different efforts. And when I say content, I mean, and intellectual property, I mean whether it is MATLAB scripts, Python scripts, PowerPoint presentations, Excel macros, geospatial content in the form of KML, in the form of map documents, and so on and so forth, right? So we're talking about different kinds of intellectual property and content that is being created by these different organizations across within their different programs and projects. And even if these organizations have managed to standardize on particular tools to create the content, there is a problem that still seems to exist across all these organizations. And by that, what I mean is that we've seen this common theme, which is all this content seems to exist in silos. There is very little communication or collaboration that happens between the folks that live in these different silos. And yes, of course, in many cases, these silos are as intended because there are restrictions in terms of what kinds of content can be shared across these different silos because they may be working on different programs and they may be at different classification levels. So there is, in many cases, there's a very good reason for these silos to exist. So one more thing I want to tell you is when we conducted these interviews with users, often we used to sit at a table like this with about 5 or 6 different users that would come in from different groups to talk to us product managers from AGI. And in many cases, these users would meet each other for the first time, right? And they would discover something about each other as part of that interview process. They would realize, oh wow, you're also writing a MATLAB script to solve this optimization problem? I think I was planning on working on that. That's great. So all of a sudden, this product management interviews that we were conducting were helping users within the organization across different silos to realize that there was something that they could learn and share from each other. So it turns out there is an opportunity for users in these organizations to collaborate and become much more efficient. So what do most organizations do to solve these kinds of problems? So the quick and easy solution is to set up a common network drive where, me working on a particular project, I save my files into the common network drive, and Bob, who's working in a different department, can also access the same network drive, and we rely on the goodness and the efficiencies of one another to be able to share and collaborate. In many cases, we've seen organizations also use source code control systems, but that can be a pretty heavy-handed tool because in many cases, users aren't necessarily developers. So source code control systems are great if you're writing code, but if you're mostly creating documents, then that can be a pretty heavy-handed tool. So the question then becomes, so what happens when these organizations don't have enterprise quality collaboration tools to help with managing content? What are they missing when they simply go back to using shared network drives or source control systems? Why is that not good? Let's talk about that. So one of the first things that you'll see that people run into in terms of deficiency is they lack version control, right? So here's another story for you, and I'm pretty sure most of you can resonate with this story. So most of SDK users are subject matter experts within their organization, right? They usually have a master's, a PhD in aerospace or physics or math, but usually very smart guys. Most of you guys are. So the typical scenario that we've seen is you have a business development team that is going after a capture effort, right? They're trying to capture a particular program. So there's an RFP, and the business development lead is writing a proposal. So he approaches our subject matter expert who's using SDK. And turns out, he wants some analysis from our subject matter expert who's typically doing some fairly complicated platform dynamics and sensor modeling and so on. So our business development lead comes to our subject matter expert who's using SDK and asks her to model some fairly complicated scenarios. So our SME, because she has SDK, quickly is able to generate some very high resolution videos, high resolution images, graphs and reports and KML, CSVs, whatever, right? Because SDK has the ability to create a lot of products from it, so which is fantastic. So she creates the scenarios, and within a few hours comes back with some fairly complex analysis, and she nicely formats it in a PowerPoint and hands it off to our business development lead, who goes off, and in an ideal world, all is good because he will come back a week later with $1 billion capture and everything is good. But in reality, things don't turn out that way. What typically happens is our business development lead comes back, and turns out that he had forgotten that there is some additional analysis that is being requested in the RFP. So he comes back to our SME, and she now has to tweak the scenario to generate some additional results. And she makes a modification to the scenario. She regenerates all the products from SDK, and she saves all the scenarios back into this common location. But what happened in the process? She overwrote the previous version that she had first generated, right? And this typically happens, it keeps going on a few times before the business development lead is finally done. But in the meantime, the amount of work that our SME had to do was fairly significant, because oftentimes if she has not been disciplined enough to save it back into the same location using the same naming conventions or renaming the scenario for whatever reason, a lot of work is lost, and there's a lot of inefficiencies in this process if you don't have a system that can manage all this for you. right? So version control, right off the bat, it's a big issue when you don't have an enterprise class system that can support that. And we all know that saving files into a standard, file repository is not going to cut it from that perspective. So what's the next thing they're missing? Search, right? We all take search for granted now that Google's made it so easy to search. But when it comes to content that we have within our enterprise organizations, search is still a nightmare, right? And especially when it comes to complex scenarios where you're modeling complex platforms, and sensors. It's not just searching for the name of the sensor or the name of the satellite, right? You really want to search based on the sensor definitions. For example, you want to pull out all the sensors that have a certain cone angle, for example. So now we've gotten to the next level where we're talking about searching based on metadata and attributes that are associated with particular objects. Now that's taking search to another level. So now you're looking for a system that can manage those attributes, that can manage the metadata for you, and not just manage the core content, right? You want to be able to search based on the attributes and metadata, and you want this to be an intelligent system. So now that is something that your standard source control systems and your standard file repositories are definitely not going to be able to give you, right? So that's an issue if you don't have a good enterprise class system. So the next one is high availability. Of course, if you're using a standard the storage system, it could be highly available. But again, these systems live within those silos, so they're not necessarily useful outside of those silos. So high availability for these systems don't really make sense when content lives in these silos. Access and security is a big issue, right? The good news about silos is that no one else outside of those silos can get into those silos. That's great. But think about this. Even within those silos, you may have different levels of classification, and you may not want everyone to have access to all data, right? So you want to have a good identity management system that use modern security protocols to protect the data and to protect the users from the data as well, right? So you want to be able to ensure that the right kinds of people have access to the right kinds of data. And that is something that a good enterprise class collaboration system will give you automatically. Collaboration. Collaboration is interesting, right? Because I kind of think of collaboration kind of like endorphins when you work out, right? You don't really know the value of endorphins, good endorphins, if you don't work out. But once you start working out and you've been doing it for a while and you stop doing it, you're like, oh my God, I feel terrible. So collaboration is kind of like that, because if you don't have tools that help you collaborate, you don't miss anything. But once you get to the point where you actually have tools that help you collaborate and you realize the efficiencies of collaboration, it's fantastic. So collaboration is like that. So a good enterprise system will help you with collaboration as well. So you can't really put a price on that until you understand the efficiencies of collaboration. The next one is scalability. I mean, this is a pretty obvious one, right? Because as you have, when you're on a project, you start off initially with just a few people, and there's not a lot of content that you're dealing with initially. But as the project grows and as the number of people grow, as the workload starts to grow, you want to have a system that can scale to meet the needs of your users, of the content, of the performance, and so on and so forth. So scalability is another very important aspect of an enterprise system, and this is something that you want to make sure that your system can support that. So when we put all of this together, right? When we put all of this together, we're talking about these different attributes, which is scalability, which is collaboration, which is access and security. But turns out that you have to look at these issues collectively, right? These features of a robust enterprise content management system, turns out they're all interrelated. So you cannot piecemeal this and say, I think this system is going to give me scalability, so I'm not going to worry about, identity management. That's typically not how these things work. So you want to select a system that can address all these different features of an enterprise class system, right? You want systems that help you with content creation and content management, that take into account collaboration amongst the different users of the enterprise, and so on and so forth. So make sure that all of these features are addressed in the enterprise system that you select. So this is where AGI's commercial products and solutions come in to address all these various issues that we've laid out so far. Our products are architected to address all these issues collectively and not piecemeal. So for example, Systems Toolkit, SDK, our desktop product, it is directly integrated with our enterprise content management system, the SDK Data Federate. So if you are an SDK user in an enterprise, your desktop SDK is directly connected to the SDK Data Federate. So when you create a scenario and when you want to save the scenario, it automatically gets saved with the right sort of user permissions and with version control. And of course, with all the right kinds of metadata stored along with the scenario, so that later on, when you're trying to search for the scenario, it's an intelligent search as opposed to a search just based on the name of the file or the name of the scenario. So that sort of integration is extremely important, because later on when you have to look for a particular version or when you have to look for a particular sensor, that becomes extremely easy for you to do, right? Also, the SDK Data Federate, Enterprise Content Management System, is a multi-tenant system. So you can share the content with others in your organization. So for example, kind of like Google Drive, you can send a link to a scenario to someone else within your organization, even though they don't necessarily have an account on the Data Federate. Everyone within the enterprise will have read-only access to the content within the content management system. You can also, in many cases, well, in all cases, SDK scenarios can automatically get a CZML view of the scenario. And that's another added value of our content management system. We talked about the SDK storing metadata to help with the search. Another thing is that the SDF scales to meet the needs of the enterprise. So as and when the number of users and the amount of content increases on your project, you can throw more hardware and more CPU at it so that it can meet the needs of your new projects. So in summary, AGI offers two enterprise class software systems that both recognize the needs of collaboration in enterprise organizations. Oh, before I summarize, one additional product capability that I failed to mention is we have also introduced the Geospatial Content Server. The Geospatial Content Server is an enterprise geospatial content processing and serving capability. So when I talk about geospatial content, I'm talking about terrain, I'm talking about imagery, and I'm talking about heterogeneous 3D geospatial content, such as buildings and vectors and so on and so forth, right? So when these kinds of content get processed, they get processed into 3D tiles, which is a very popular format for cesium visualization. So the Geospatial Content Server is AGI's enterprise product to manage terrain imagery and 3D geospatial data. And again, this has all the features of enterprise class systems that we just talked about. So again, in summary, AGI offers two enterprise class software systems that both recognize the needs of collaboration in enterprise organizations. One is the SDK Data Federate, the enterprise content management system, fully integrated with SDK, our flagship product. And the second one is the geospatial content server that is used to process and serve terrain imagery and heterogeneous 3D geospatial content in the form of 3D tiles. And with that, I wrap up this presentation. Thank you very much.